Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening, Ken.
Good to see everyone. Good to see everyone. Tonight we have Ken and Stan, and as always, Dr. Rick's with us. Welcome everybody to episode 479. Believe it or not, every
Oh,
time I
wow.
read that, it's hard to believe we've been doing this that long. Paul's victory over Roman imprisonment, a biblical perspective. So, Dr. Ricks, if you would start us out, that would be wonderful.
Well, we're gonna. This first joke is kind of not a joke, sort of, kind of. Um, the wokesters don't like the word woman or mother. I'm not making this up because it sounds so crazy. They want us to call them birthing persons, and I believe this Mother's Day the wokesters are going to get the Bud Light treatment. We're
you
going to
know,
ignore them and call them mothers anyway.
Yeah.
it sure feels like we've entered max insanity. I mean, it can't get any crazier. I say that, you watch tomorrow, something even nuttier will they'll come up with.
This
But
sure will.
it's achieved maximum craziness.
At maximum velocity.
Oh, buddy, you got that right. Big time, does it ever?
Well, speaking of moms, they were kind of having a nice evening together, and the man says, "I love you," and mom said, "Is that you speaking, or is it that wine you're drinking speaking?" He says, "No, I'm talking to the wine." The woman comes in and says, "Honey, I got good news and bad news about the car." "Well, tell me the good news." "The airbag works."
Oh man.
Now, this one, a man approached a good looking woman in the grocery store. And she was kind of shocked. He says, "Well, the reason I want to hang out with you is I lost my wife in this big store. And I learned from the past, if I want to find her, anytime I'm with a good looking woman, she finds me fast." She appears out of nowhere. Anyway, the first man says, "My wife's taking a trip to the Caribbean." The second man says, "Jamaica." He says, "No, she wants to go." Okay, the final one, the woman says to the man, she says, "Did you know that women are smarter than men?" The man says, "No, I didn't know any such thing." She says, "See, that proves what I mean." There was one or two that I dare not tell, but maybe I'll think about it and tell them next week. But anyway, the reason um, we went to this topic is, when you're reading the Bible, when you're reading Paul's, they call them prison epistles, his letters when he was under house arrest in Rome. Um, and you start reading them deeply and you realize that Paul turned a crisis into the kind of like a booster shot for the gospel going to the headquarters of the entire world. And you never think of it that way, but that's really what actually happened. Um, I'll just give a little bit of the background. Most of us know this. Um, the officials in the Middle East, Paul could tell they were getting bribes and political pressure from the leadership in Jerusalem, and they wanted to bring him back so they could assassinate him. They had all kind of assassination plans, and he could tell, I can't trust these guys. So, being a Roman citizen, he appealed to the highest court, to Caesar himself, which meant there's nothing they could do about it. They had to take him to Rome, getting him out of the area. Um, and the interesting thing about being in Rome, he was, they allowed him to rent a house, and he was under imperial guard. The imperial guard is one of the elite military units of the Roman Empire. He was untouchable. because most cities he'd go in within 6 months, they get a mob. You've read all those things. They get mobs and all kinds of people. They'll try to kill him, stone him, run him out of town. They couldn't touch Paul. Isn't that a great situation? I mean, except for the fact he's got to face Caesar in 2 years for a decision, which could be life or death. But except for that, that's a great situation to be in.
Absolutely. He, you know, I was thinking about that, how it really shouldn't have been a surprise, though, because Jesus said, you know, you're going to testify at Jerusalem, but you're also going to be a witness for me at Rome. Paul just didn't know how he was going to get to Rome. He didn't know he was going to go as a prisoner. And I think that's really fascinating. And but if you read between the lines in Paul's writings of all of those letters, you find out that he realized that it was for the benefit of the gospel that he was there at Rome, even though he was a prisoner.
And Paul was so brave that he took an attitude. When you read, that's not the topic for tonight, but when you read into what he said he didn't think he would die. He really didn't think so. And he was right. He was released. He said, the churches still need me. But if I die, you know, he'll be with Christ in his consciousness the sooner. He didn't mind. He was willing to die for the gospel. I mean, that's a great attitude to have.
He's very courageous. You know, I was also thinking about the fact that he wasn't the first one that had, you know, given up his life for the benefit of the church and the gospel message. You know, if you think about John the Baptist, he sort of went through the same scenario. He had fulfilled the prophecies. He came and preached the gospel. He preached repentance to the nation there at Jerusalem, and he was very famous. He baptized Jesus, and then he found himself in prison. And, you know, that's when he sent and said, you know, are you the Messiah, or we look for somebody else? Because he didn't think he would die either. And yet he was beheaded. But Jesus went on to say, you know, of all those that were born of women, there was none greater than John the Baptist. And it was out of his life and his works that he did that he became sort of like a martyr, you know, and became, you know, and propelled the gospel and prepared the way for Jesus, of course, and the preaching of Jesus as well.
You know, Paul getting a safe place to preach the gospel in Rome was quite a thing. Would you read our first verse, Philippians 1, please, Ken?
Just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my change and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers of me of grace.
And I wonder, when he used the term in chains, I wonder if Paul was using that metaphorically just to gin up the churches to be stronger. But, you know, some writers say that it probably had a long chain, but he was chained to at least one soldier oftentimes just to make it difficult for someone to escape. Although at Paul's age, I doubt he really would have made that escape attempt, but that probably was procedure. So maybe he really was chained, but whether he was or not, it does make a great metaphor, doesn't it? I'm in chains for the gospel.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you think about how many times he used that word chains in the New Testament, you know, it was a really good analogy for him, you know. But and again, too, the people that looked up to Paul and benefited from the gospel message, he too was sort of a, you know, maybe not a martyr, but he had a martyr's personality in the message of preaching, because I was trying to think of some examples, you know, people like Castro and Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, people that had spent time in prison sort of became a figure for the movement. Martin Luther King was another one that spent time in prison and later became, like Nelson Mandela, became president because he was so famous for what he had sacrificed for. And Paul, in essence, had sort of done the same thing, for the gospel message. And he sort of became a hero at a time when they needed a hero.
By the way, you might find this interesting. You know that, and Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail is famous, but in public schools now, they have to parch his speeches. They can't read any of his entire speeches. A lot of them they don't read at all because he makes too many Bible references.
I know.
And they can't have the Bible among public school kids. Oh,
yeah.
All right.
I'm not making that up. That's crazy, isn't it?
Well, we got a Republican candidate. I just saw this today, and he's wanting to raise the voting age to 25. And his reasoning is, well, obviously military and other ways, but his reasoning is that whatever the young group is now are not being taught anything about the Constitution. So most of your kids, and this is true, most of your kids have no clue what the Constitution is or anything about it. And so, he does have a little leg to stand on there, but it's not going to fly anywhere.
I wouldn't mind doing, of course, but I wouldn't mind seeing it. You really don't fully grow up till you're about 25, maybe.
Right. Well, the one of the commentators that I saw said that that's how we got our current president at this time, because all the young people went out there and voted against Trump, and not knowing, they just believed what they saw and heard on TV and radio and stuff. And they didn't hear it on radio. Obviously, if they listened to the radio, they wasn't listening to anything we listened to. So, but that's how they got there, and that's what that's what this guy's saying. He said that's one of the ways that they got the election from that way.
Easily persuaded.
Yes.
By the way, you could argue that Paul's first audience was the soldiers themselves, because as they rotated different guards in different shifts, they heard Paul preaching to various groups that came to his house. He may even just preach to them too, who knows? And we know from other letters of Paul that a number of people from Caesar's household, that would include the imperial guard, we presume, were converted to Christianity.
You have to think that Paul had a really dynamic personality, and he was a student of Gamaliel's. He was a star student, I believe. He was very gifted in the scripture, and when he was persecuting the church, he was more powerful than all of his constituents. So he was driven. He was a man of tenacity. But also he had a great number of stories to tell from all the travels and places that he had been, and all the experiences he had suffered as a result of being persecuted because he was preaching the gospel message. So he had a really compelling story along with the gospel message itself, and of course the eyewitness account of Jesus. So I imagine those Roman soldiers had never heard anything like that in their lives, and they were moved by it. And I think they were converted. And we know that to be the case.
And how many of them were in the Church of Rome that Paul wrote letters to?
Mm-hmm. That's true. One thing, his trip to get there got him a lot of, if you want to call it, street fame. You just go it's in the last few chapters of the book of Acts. All the miracles and the storm and all that, he arrived in Rome with a big rep.
Yep.
And we believe the guards knew, or were soon told by him, the only reason I'm in these chains is because of the gospel message.
And what a great attitude. what a great attitude he had in saying that. He could have said, "Oh, poor, woe is me. I shouldn't be here. This isn't right." But he just went with it because he knew God was guiding him and knew God led him there to Rome.
Let's go to Ephesians 6:18, please, Ken.
Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit. And for me, that utterance may be given to me, that I may open my mouth boldly to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that in it I may speak boldly as I ought to speak.
And by the way, we might wonder, how would all those Romans became Christians? What we think is Rome being a huge city, maybe the biggest in the empire, many converted to Judaism. They became Jewish proselytes, and they would go to Jerusalem for the holy days, like the Feast of Tabernacles or Pentecost. And then they learned from the Christians all about this Jesus fellow and the great miracles. And some of them may even have heard Peter and John and others preaching in the temple. So when they went back to Rome and said, okay, now what do we do? And Paul, of course, wrote a letter to be circulated among the Christians that were there. And they probably the ones paying for his rented house. I would make that assumption, the church that was in Rome. So this was a big deal, him coming to their city. And we know from things he wrote, he was the first, and at least up to that point, the only apostle to ever go to Rome when he first went.
And I like your point that you made about him making it into the circles of people there at Rome that he may have never been able to approach had he just gone and preached like he did some of these other cities. The fact that he became a prisoner and the events surrounding his journey to Rome, like the island of Malta, the shipwreck, all of that story, he became famous. And there he was, planted right in the midst of the royalty there in Rome, and he's preaching to people that are right close to Caesar. He may have never been able to do that had he tried to take on this task by himself. It's sort of like he was allowed the into the stage door, from behind, right in where all the stars are.
I imagine, I don't know if I know they had attorneys, but I don't know how much of that went back and forth to the throne and his key advisors from prisoners waiting on the trial. But if so, I'm sure Paul, being a persuasive fellow, got his influence in, right?
Well, we know, I hate to keep being the first to comment, but we know that there were those of the household of Caesar that were called saints by the Apostle Paul. And so he had converts right there in Caesar's household. So he had made influence.
And like the captain of the guard who brought him to Rome did a lot of favors for Paul. When you go through the book of Acts, he probably became converted too. Or at least it's a likely possibility. He saw things that if you were him, no way you could deny this guy's not a messenger from God.
Absolutely.
Let's go to Acts 28:14, please, Ken.
Now when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard. But Paul was permitted to dwell by himself with the soldier who guarded him. Paul called the leaders of the Jews together. He said to them, "Men and brethren, though I have done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, the Romans, who, when they had examined me, wanted to let me go. But when the Jews spoke against it, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had anything of which to accuse my nation and speak with you, because for the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain."
You know, Paul didn't want it. And by the way, when it says the Jews, you know, he means the leadership. Paul, well, Jesus was quite popular with many Jews, and you can just see the crowds. He was like Elvis almost. But the Jewish leadership, with some exception like Nicodemus, but they were out to stop Christianity. And Paul, apparently because of his fame and status, it's not just what you say, it's who you are saying what you say. Does that make sense? If you're world famous and you say it, it has a lot more impact than if you're just some Joe. And in the Jewish world, Paul was somewhat of a star and a celebrity. I know it's hard for us to think of that, a religious celebrity, but he was sort of like, I don't know, who's a religious celebrity in today's world? I can't think of anybody, but you get the
Like
general
the Pope?
idea, right? You know,
The Pope is a religious celebrity. Not that he's
or
a good thing, but
The nicey guy.
or what about the famous evangelist from North Carolina, Billy Graham? He was sort of in the Jewish community. He was sort of the Billy Graham or younger version of the Billy Graham of the Jewish community. Does that make sense? I know you're gonna say that analogy doesn't quite fit totally,
No,
but
I don't think so. I don't think Billy Graham had any kind of Jewish inkling whatsoever. Um, but Paul, you know, he appealed to Caesar, which made you know, he could have been set free. He could appeal to Caesar because he was a Roman citizen, even though he was a Jew. So I guess they bought and paid for it, right? If I'm not mistaken. And he was a Roman citizen to begin with, so he appealed to Caesar. That's why he went to Rome, is because he appealed to Caesar in a trial. And otherwise, I think that if I'm not mistaken, it says they would let him go. So that's interesting to me because it tells me that you know, maybe that was divine providence from long before that was known that Paul was going to do these things.
I believe God wanted him to arrive in Rome the way he did. And he didn't trust to somehow allow him to get assassinated by, you know, those two different times, 40 men took a vow that they wouldn't eat and drink until they had assassinated Paul.
Right.
Now, I don't know what happened to those guys, but you talk about dedicated to the target, you know.
They starved to death.
yeah, I was just gonna say, I bet they didn't starve to death.
You know,
But
something else I've always found interesting is, you know, when they slapped Paul up, you know, across the face, then he said something about being a Roman citizen, and they were scared to death that, you know, they had mistreated a Roman citizen. So it sort of tells me that Paul wasn't real flagrant about the fact that he was a Roman citizen. You know, he was convicted of his Jewish background, and he didn't just, you know, wave the Roman citizenship around and wear it like a badge of identity. They were sort of surprised that he was a Roman citizen, and they were scared that they were going to be prosecuted for mistreating someone without having been taken to trial first.
He kind of held that one in his
wish
back
that
pocket.
American citizenship carried that.
Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, Ken. I'm sorry to interrupt
He
you.
kind of held that one in his back pocket, it seems like, for when he needed it.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you wonder if he did actually do that, Ken. I like that comment. You know, did he know, or did it just pop into his mind that, hey, I'm a Roman citizen, I could do this? I think he was smart enough to hold that back as a wild card, you know, if he ever needed it, and he
Well, it
did.
makes perfect sense because he knew exactly what the implications of being a Roman citizen was, and things that it's hard to say this, but evidently things never got bad enough, as bad as they got in his past, but bad enough for him to pull that out to get him out of a certain situation. It was perfect for the situation he was found himself in to get out of the area.
Well, the other thing I've always wondered too is, put yourself in Paul's shoes. What does it mean to appeal to Caesar? I mean, do you really want to go to Rome and be in front of all of the erudite in the Roman Parliament or whatever, the Roman government there. That would be terrifying for the average citizen to think you're going to go before Caesar to plead your case, when they could send you right over across the street to the Colosseum. It would be something I don't think you would do just on a whim. It would be something that would be done with a lot of consideration before you made that use that trump card, if you will.
Yeah, I agree.
No pun intended.
Or could it be that the scripture came out and said God will choose the words for you, and that popped into Paul's mind is because God. I mean, all these letters came from Rome, pretty much, and they were to the churches that he founded. So did God send him to Rome for a reason to write the Bible, to inspire him to write the Bible?
Sure they were.
And actually, and I believe 2 of the epistles went to churches that Paul did not establish, but his disciples from Ephesus established. He says, you haven't seen me by face, but I consider you mine. I mean, Paul was saying that in his letter. So it actually helped him expand his reach, if you want to look at it that way, his reach by letter. And the thing you notice in that scripture, he told the Jews, he was arrested for the hope of Israel, which of course is Jesus, the Messiah. And it also, just for those who are big on the replacement theory, Paul was not supporting replacement theory that the church has totally replaced Israel and God's forgotten all about Israel. Nope. Christ came for the hope of Israel. He will save Israel completely, probably in the somewhat near future. And I believe Israelite nations are being blessed. I realize we're losing many of our blessings. I'm not saying we aren't, but we still have some of those blessings to this very day. And I really marvel when you look at American history. I probably said this more than once, but maybe the first president in 1892, George Washington, and about a century later, America, and a few years, but somewhere a little over a century later, America went from 13 little colonies on the East Coast of the Appalachian Mountains, to a worldwide empire with Navy bases in Guam and some other island off the coast of China. And that includes the Philippine Islands and Hawaii. That's kind of amazing. And Alaska, and I had this book, I don't know where it is now. It showed you all the chunks of North America and Alaska and Hawaii, what year they came into possession of the U.S. government. It's like God was pouring blessing upon blessing. And I'm not saying there aren't problems, and there are always economic problems in the whole world, but people are still crossing deserts and all kinds of stuff to get here.
Exactly.
Ain't nobody.
Does that tell you something?
Ain't nobody ever died in a duct tape and rubber raft trying to get from Miami to Cuba.
Or to sneak into China.
Exactly.
I mean, I think about it. Or to sneak into Russia.
Yeah, nobody. Not a one.
One of my friends said one time, we have the richest poor people in the world.
Oh, absolutely.
Because of the prosperity we have here. I mean, it just is unbelievable. And you think, I love that thought of, I heard someone the other day say, our country was founded in turmoil, and in a period of turmoil too, in a period of war. Yet we were founded and we established this great country. And you think of some of the examples of like Alaska or the Louisiana Purchase. That's a fascinating study to find out that we bought that land for just pennies per acre, and doubled the size of the United States at in 03 or something like that, 1806 or whatever. But to go to a place where we're dominating the world financially and aerospace technology and all of it is incredible to see the advancement that we made in that period of time. And we're still under the shadow of those blessings, even in our day, even though we did very little to bring about.
So I would argue that God is still blessing Israel. And even the little nation in the Middle East, I saw a ranking. In spite of their size, they're ranked number 11 in world power when you combine their very high tech economy and for their size, country, a very tough military. They're ranked number 11 on a power ranking, and it's one of the smallest countries in the world. Can you see that even Judah and America are still being blessed? I know
I
that's
do.
ending. I'm not saying it isn't slowly declining. I'm not denying that we're on a bad road with bad leadership, but we are. And all my only point was when Paul went to them, he said, "For the hope of Israel." So Israel is still important to God.
He was the one that wrote, "And all Israel shall be saved." That was his summation of his, uh, his portion of Romans there. That it wasn't. God is not going to put away Israel. He's going to eventually save Israel because he still loves them, and his blessings are still going to go out to them at some time in the future.
And if we were to have a big repentance, I know that's not going to happen, but God would bless us even more because you'll see that in the history of the Bible. By the way, those Jews said to Paul, "We know that you're meaning the Christians, are a disliked sect, but we haven't heard anything specific about you." And they were considered a sect within Judaism. And that's interesting. If they had been switched over to Sunday and Easter, there's no way they'd been considered a sect within Judaism. I mean, it's a small point, but if you read that last book of Acts or so, you'll see that out there. Um, but let's get to the good part. What happened in Rome that was so successful? Um, um, Paul's message. Let's go to Philippians 1:12, please, Ken.
But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear.
That's what kind of gave me the idea about the martyrs. They were sort of using Paul as a martyr, even though he wasn't dead. But he was a champion for them, and because he was in chains, they had the courage to stand up for the gospel, which they may have never had the courage to do before then, because they had a cause and they had someone to stand up for. And part of the Roman uh, citizenry and the folks in power at Rome believed Paul, and they had a little bit of support there, so they had favor with the Romans as well.
For all he went through, he just kept coming. And he just kept coming. He doubled down. He kept coming. Nothing deterred him. Nothing stopped him. And that's got to be inspirational in itself.
And his notoriety gave made their Christianity more important. You're part of that church that famous guy Paul is having a hearing in front of Caesar somewhere in the future about, and his notoriety just kind of elevated the whole issue of Jesus Christ in Rome. Um, and that's a good thing. But here's the part that I think, when I looked into it, I found most surprising. Paul says that most preach because they love Paul and they love Christ, but some were preaching Christ out of spite and envy. And that's what I want to get into. Let's go to Philippians 1:15, Ken. Let's go into that. Why would you do it out of envy and spite?
Some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains, but the later out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel.
Paul was so big and so unselfish. He didn't mind people preaching Christ even out of spite and jealousy. And let's read 1:18 and 19. And then I want to discuss the motive of the people who were preaching it out of spite. What was their bad ambition that he talked about?
What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ.
So Paul was positive about it. But the thought occurred to me, why would someone who's very ambitious want to preach Christ out of spite and envy? And here's what I believe, at least to some extent, must have been true. Paul had too much influence. And some said, you know, I want to be the major Christian leader in Rome. Think about Bishop of Rome. We know historically that was the most powerful position. I'm going to the detail, but we know that now. But is it possible that some people, even then, this has been around 62 AD or so, figured out this religion is going to be very popular. This could be a lucrative, powerful position.
That has always influenced man from the beginning of time. That is a good thought. I mean, it obviously was, and there were people like Alexander Coppersmith and some of the others that persecuted Paul, and it was about money and power. And I had another thought, though, was I'd like to introduce as well, along with what you said, Dr. Ricks, and that is he's a convict. We don't want a convict as our leader. He's in prison. You know, I think they looked upon some of these guys who were trying to find a reason maybe to gain popularity and influence, use that as an excuse to convince people, hey, we can't afford to have a convict as our star guy, the head guy, you know. So they put him down. And of course, if you read between the lines, Paul's appearance and speech may have been, you know, unpresentable as someone to be the person, the poster child, or the person out front as a leader for this great organization we're trying to put together. We can't use him because he's not presentable.
By the way, I've read this in commentaries that Paul was bald on the top, you know, just hair on the side. He was bald and he had bad eyes. And at this point, he's getting older. So he's older, at least partially bald, bad eyes. And with all the beatings and stuff he took, he's not going to be the tall, handsome, I don't know, whatever you think a great religious leader looks like. I don't know, picture it.
He wasn't Saul of the Old Testament.
Right.
You know, he didn't have the look and the glamour and the you know, the speech and everything. He didn't have all of that, the showmanship.
See, I'll argue you can have the brains or you can have the hair. but also there may have been another part of this too. And this is going out a little bit, but if you take a step further, let's even assume that at this point there weren't any false doctrines involved. It's just a matter of leadership and the money potential. And there may be some little groups that already coalesced. And some of the leaders thought to themselves, well, look, if we can get this Christianity ginned up more and more, many of the administrators in the Roman government are pagans. And maybe we can get them so afraid of Christianity, they'll have Paul executed when it's all over. And then the ambitious one said, then I'll be here to lead and have to worry about Paul's influence because he might not like a guy like me being in charge or a group of men.
Well, you know, even in Jerusalem, he had Jerusalem in an uproar. So he had powerful influence, and he was able to do that in Jerusalem. Maybe he got to the point where he was doing that in Rome, and he was having a great deal of influence. And anytime somebody gets the attention of the masses, the people in power are very envious, and they want to crunch that power. They feel threatened. So, I think that was there.
There's a certain presidential candidate, I think his populist influence frightens some politicians.
Oh, absolutely.
Even in his own party.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Not
similarly, the more they pounded on Paul, the stronger he became.
And it seemed to be the case.
It's almost like what you might see in a modern day media. The more that they tried to put him down and out, the more free publicity he got out of the deal. So right. The talk was around Rome. And I read somewhere, I think it was during Paul's day, that there were somewhere around 300 or 400 churches in Rome. So this wasn't just one or two churches we're talking about. We're talking about a lot of influence. I think now today in Rome there's 800 something churches. But even in his day, there was quite a number of people that were, he was within the circles of all of those churches, the talk was. So I'm sure he was stirring the pot while he was there.
And apparently his house was big enough that all the Jews could meet there. So let's say 20 or 30 people could come to his house. And apparently they could stand up in those days and listen to a sermon. So he didn't have to have that many seats. They may have had that many seats, but he get 30 people, 40 standing up. And Paul was available all the time. He didn't go anywhere. You could imagine the influence he could potentially have had, right?
Maybe they were envious of that because he didn't have a job. He was just sitting there preaching all day and eating good food and had a nice place to stay and something he was envious about.
We even speculate that maybe the Imperial Guard brought him the food too. I'm not saying they did, but is there anybody that's under their charge? They have to take care of the people that Caesar wants to talk to and deal with. Mm-hmm. So therefore they have to protect him and feed him, I'm presuming, right?
Well, you would think that anyone like Paul he was probably very nice to the guards, and that never happened. And people get drawn to people like Paul who would face down anybody and would run away and scared. So you'd probably figure he had a couple of friends in there, or a couple of people that respected him and kind of thought it was humorous what he was able to accomplish with all these bigwig people that the guards probably didn't care for, because they're in a lowly position. So I'm sure they supported him in whatever way some of them were able to,
And some of the people that were even Christians in the Christian circles would not have had access to some of the important people Paul was able to communicate with, and so I'm sure that ruffled some feathers as well. Here's this guy. He claims to be a Christian, and yet he's got all this influence, and he's right there in the know and in the circles of the important people in Rome. And it just I could see human nature there taking its toll on envy and jealousy.
Human nature hasn't changed in 6,000 years.
And jealousy, they call it the green monster. I have seen envy and jealousy cause it. Oh, well, I won't go into it, but I almost think that's one of the worst aspects of human nature.
I agree.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. Seen many people leave church because of that.
And like I told my sons many years, I said, listen, the world isn't fair. If you grow up thinking the world's going to be fair, you're going to be jealous and mad and angry. I'm going into details, but sometimes promotions aren't based purely on merit. They're based on, well, I'm going to it, but you get my point. There's no use getting all jealous and upset because the world isn't fair. Anyway, let's read Philippians 1:27, please, Ken.
Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and not in any way terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that from God.
So as Paul was brave, he was encouraging the various churches out there to be brave.
You know, I read somewhere that Paul wrote, they think that Paul wrote Ephesians, Colossians, and Philippians at the exact same time. You don't see that when you see them in the enumeration or the order in which they're compiled in the New Testament. But the fact that I believe it was Tychicus was the one that delivered all three of those messages or those letters, they think he wrote those at the same time. And I guess I never really put that together in the past, because you see these letters, you think they may have been written years apart, but he was in Rome for 2 years under house arrest. He may have sat down one weekend and wrote all three of those letters and sent them out to be delivered. And they think maybe 4, because on one occasion he said, for them to read this letter, but also read the letter, give this letter to the Laodicean church and read the letter that was written to them. So we don't even have that letter. But Paul, when you think about it, if he did write all three of these letters at the same time, think about what is contained in all of them. And when you think about the letter written to the Ephesians and what it had to talk about, talking about the oneness, the universality of the church, and how great how grandeur the Church of God is. It was really inspirational to think that he may have written all three of those at the same time.
Yeah.
One commentary said that Ephesians there's no personal greeting for one person, that he intended that because Ephesus was part of a mail route that we know from the book of Revelation.
Right.
He intended that letter to go on the route to all 7 churches. And so they're supposed to, go from church to church and circulate it. I was speculating the other day why the letter to the Laodiceans never was preserved. It could be he sent them such a harsh letter.
That's what I was thinking. They burned it. They burned it in a fire.
They didn't want copies of this circulating all over the place.
Right.
We would read you the letter to Laodicea, but it's in the fireplace.
It somehow didn't survive.
Oh, that's good. Never thought of that.
We don't know that. But, they made copies of those other letters and passed them to their hundreds of them all over the, Middle East and Greek world. But that letter didn't, for some reason, copies of that didn't survive. It makes you wonder.
Yeah. Oh, my.
Let's go to Ephesians 3:13, please, Ken.
Therefore, I ask that you do not lose heart at my tribulations for you, which is your glory. For this reason, I bow my knees to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man.
So he's saying that he's suffering for just giving the churches one more reason to be bolder and stronger. And I was thinking about the very first part of Paul's arrest. Actually, he gave a great witness. I'll describe it, and you all probably know when you read Acts 22 and 23, and even a little bit build up in 21. They said when Paul arrived in Jerusalem, the other apostle says, "Look, you're so famous, everybody's going to know you're here. We can't, like only church members will know. It's sort of like Elvis coming to town. Everybody's going to hear you're here." So they told him some things to do in the temple to prove that the lies they were telling about him were true. Anyway, he got mobbed at the temple, and they were about to do Paul in. And let's read Acts 21:30, and then we'll discuss what a great witness Paul made at that point.
People ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple. Now, as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in uproar. He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander of the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob.
In the next couple verses, when you read about it, it's interesting. If you can picture this in your mind, they built a fortress in Jerusalem, not close to the temple, because they're worried about, the Romans were worried about Jerusalem being, rebellious, not out of control. So anyway, and the fortress had a long set of stairs all the way to the top. So Paul, told him he was a Roman citizen, and he could, he could speak Greek well and Hebrew, and he said, "Let me talk to the crowd." So there's Paul at the top of the staircase. At the bottom of the staircase is an entire Roman army, or a good chunk of it. And almost the whole city, 30, 40, 50, 60,000, a sea of people surrounding the fortress. And Paul, gestures for silence. And then he witnesses to the Jewish people. And they can't stop him from talking because there's an army between him and them. That would be a great scene if Hollywood could do it right.
Yeah. I agree. That would be a good one. Jesus said on one occasion that he didn't hope that they would be offended in him in that night, that he was going to be crucified. And it's almost like Jesus was saying, I'm going to do this for you, and I hope you guys aren't offended by what happens, because the outcome is not going to be what you had expected. Paul has the same concern for the people when he makes this statement that, I hope you don't lose heart because of the tribulation I'm going through. It just shows the real outgoing concern and unselfish attitude that Paul had for not only the gospel message and the preaching, but for the people that were witnessing all of what was happening. And I think it began there on those steps when he made that testimony to all the Jewish people.
And I love it when he talked about what happened to him on the road to Damascus.
And all of the, if you read through all of the descriptions that he had when he was, he was beaten with rods, and he was whipped, and he was stoned and left for dead, and he was in the ocean, left a day and a night in the deep. And it's, I guess I feel a little ashamed and embarrassed because none of us have suffered anything close to what he endured, and yet he's standing there like a rock, even in chains, still preaching the gospel message. And that is such an admirable thing. I guess in a way I look to him as one of the biblical heroes as well.
Yeah. And think about this, that he's speaking to the Jews here. What a shock for them. Think about that. What a shock for them. They watched him probably at Stephen's stoning and everything that went on, and how he was so against the church. And then all of a sudden, next time they see him, he is preaching the gospel. What a shock for those people. Can you imagine that?
That's a good point, Ken. It must have made them. It's almost like, I'll just say this out loud, it's like a Democrat converting to becoming a Republican.
Yeah.
Someone popular Democrat, becoming a completely different, opposite person that they were. It just drives everybody mad.
Yes.
It drives everybody mad.
That was, what's his name? Oh, I forget. That happened back about 6 years ago. 5, 6 years ago, that guy. 7
Yeah.
years ago. What's his name?
I remember the event.
I think I remember that
They
too.
call him, whatever his name is, 2.0.
Yeah.
And he's on
Larry Elder. Larry Elder.
Is it Larry
It's
Elder?
that other guy.
I think
It's the
the
other
Larry
black
Elder,
guy that's
or,
on Fox.
Yeah, it's not Larry
2.0.
Elder. Dr.
Right,
Ross is
it's-
thinking about the right guy.
I
Yeah.
know it. He has kind of a scrunchy. I'm not putting him down. He has
it's not
kind of a
Larry Elder,
scrunchy
so-
face when he focuses on something. Does
Yes,
that make
yes,
sense?
Yes.
Terrell? No.
Terrell.
Leo Terrell.
Leo
Leo
Terrell,
Terrell
that's right.
2.0.
Yeah,
He was
2.0.
a staunch leftist, and he completely flipped a 180.
And that's hard to do, knowing human nature. People, they want to believe what they want to believe, regardless of the facts.
And you know what? He's a more powerful influence since he flipped than he ever was as a big-time liberal.
Right.
Because a lot of times, liberals say what you expect them to say all the time. There's no great surprise. So, listening to him like, oh, he's going to say the party talking points. What else is it? You know what I'm saying? That's all they say. Whatever the talking points are, that's what they say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they must have felt that Paul was a traitor. They hated him with a purple passion, too, because he went to the other side. He became a Christian, and he claimed all of these things that happened to him, and now he's very powerful. And they must have hated him beyond belief because of it, because they felt he had betrayed the Jewish community.
And they couldn't stop him. All the power and might and conniving and scheming and everything known to man, they couldn't beat him, they couldn't drown him, they couldn't do anything to him. You would think after a while you'd be like, you know what? Maybe I ought to join his team. This guy can't be beat.
How many times did they try to kill him? Think about it. I mean, they said, like you said, they 40 of them said we'll need to eat or drink till we kill him, till he's dead, and they couldn't get it done.
And by the way, how they got him out of the city of Rome, his nephew mentioned the plot to assassinate him the next morning, which is probably well planned, knowing Jewish people, their leadership. His nephew told the captain of the guard, he had a whole army take Paul out, I'll say at midnight, more or less, close to midnight, in the middle of the night when nobody would know it. And then once he got him out, then they put him on a horse in the cavalry group, which could move faster, got him to the coast, to the imperial city that runs, that part of the Roman Empire, Caesarea. And then he was in the palace, which is sort of like palace is like a jail. They couldn't just break in there and get him. So there, all of a sudden, they woke up one morning, we're going to assassinate Paul. Where is he? Well, he's in you mean he's on the coast? He's gone already in the middle of the night. I mean, think how frustrated you'd be if the people out to kill him. The army snuck him out in the middle of the night. They just couldn't. In the book of Acts, like from chapter 13 to chapter 28, is all about Paul's miraculous escapes.
I read something that they think that Paul did, the way that Luke ended the book of Acts. And it's interesting that you said that. He sort of ends the book of Acts abruptly and said Paul lived 2 years in house arrest, and that's sort of the end of the book of Acts. Some have speculated and that Paul didn't suffer martyrdom at that time, that you read in the 2 Timothy where he said, the time of my departure is nigh. You just read the New Testament, you think that he went to Rome, he was under house arrest, and he went to trial and he was martyred. But some believe that he, went on that he was released. And one of the points that was made was if Paul had been released, or if he didn't go to trial the first time he was in prison, that Luke would have Luke would have, sort of admonished Paul and stood up for him in his writing. So you only have two. I guess you only have two choices here. Either Luke died, which is, I guess, could have been a possibility, or the fact Paul didn't go to trial and was released for some degree and was rearrested later on when he wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy in the book of Titus.
By the way, I've even got a chart in two of my Bible commentaries, and most of the scholars believe this. After 2 years, Paul was released and did go to Spain like he originally intended.
Yeah.
And knowing Paul, he probably converted a bunch of people in Spain and then took a boat back to the part of the world where he had built his churches, Antioch in northern Israel, and visited all his churches, reinforcing them. And then he moved to the Illyrian Peninsula, which is across the water from Rome, if you can think of a map. And he started building new churches there. And this is like 5 or 6 or 7 years, according to the charts, after he was released. And I guess the pagans got enough political power to get him arrested. He didn't volunteer this time in taking to Rome. He spent another 2 years in Rome, making the Roman church stronger even. But this time, he was the older man, and he was martyred behind Caesar's throne. And that's what his head was chopped off. And that sounds gruesome. But in a way, that's a quick death. And you're saying that you'd want to go through it. By the way, do you know where the term tip came from?
The term what?
How the term tipping the help. You know where that term came from? Well, in England, they had the Tower of London where they had off with his head was actually done, in English political infighting. If the king could say off with your head. And so they would tip the executioner extra money to use as sharp a blade as he could, so it was like a quick, clean death instead of a messy one. And so in English circles, you tip the help so that they give you the best service.
That's the best service. Okay.
I know that sounds crazy, but that's what I'm told. That's where it came from.
Whew.
So if you don't want them to spit in your soup, be sure and tip them. Yeah. But if that is true, I mean, there's two ways to look at it. Obviously, we can feel bad for Paul, but if he was much older at this point and his body had been through a lot, he could have died of heart failure, something like that, within a year or two. Been in the hospital for a while or something. Or he could be a glorious martyr. Doesn't it seem more appropriate for Paul to be a heroic martyr in Rome?
Well, when you look at all the churches that were named after him down through the centuries, it almost seems as though he was, died some sort of a heroic martyr.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I'm not trying to take anything away from having a nice, quiet, natural death, is what most of us will have, of course. But we need to appreciate the heroes too, and I have some scriptures to back up our thought that the people who opposed Paul in Rome, probably were greedy for money. Ken, would you read those next 3 scriptures that we put up on the screen? Starting with 1 Timothy 3:3.
Not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous. And let's see. Likewise, deacons must be reverent, not double-tongued, not given to too much wine, not greedy for money. And for a bishop must be blameless as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money.
And I didn't put everything down I could have put down. Paul saw some people were attracted to leadership in the church because they were greedy.
That seemed to be the theme of those 3 scriptures. Not greedy for money.
I've even heard people who came to Ambassador College, well, I won't call them greedy, but it was a good living. And it was almost that was their reason for being there instead of, I can't put my words on it, instead of being dedicated to serving God, they were there for the salary.
Yeah.
Can you see a problem with that approach?
Well, of course, because then you have to adhere to whoever's paying you the money. Kind of like, the Bidens. Oh, did I say that out loud?
Oh, no. Just
Set up
because
a
they
few
get millions from
LLCs,
China does not mean the Biden crime family is really a crime family. That's what the media is telling us.
Just because your 7-year-old grandchild's getting paid from Chinese slush funds into your LLC doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong.
uh, um, and now some of them, I think, eventually there were people with bad doctrines who also were there as well. Let's read verse 11 in that Titus chapter.
Whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things which they ought not, for the sake of dishonest gain.
Now, here's where I think I'm going to say what I think how Satan would think. If you were Satan and you saw Paul turning Rome upside down and Christianity gaining a momentum, and you couldn't seem to stop it, because even when Satan persecuted Christians, they got stronger. I mean, in Rome in that time period, and even when he martyred people, they were so magnanimous in their martyrdom. People were converted at their martyrdom, and you read about that in history books. So if you're Satan and you're watching all this, you're thinking, I can't seem to stop this thing. Maybe I'll encourage leaders to join Christianity who are amenable, corruptible, greedy, that I can use them in the future to co-opt and infiltrate the church.
He did that in the past with Israel. Even during the time when they had the temple in Jerusalem, where they would, usurp the authority there, and they hired the lowest of the people to eventually overrun the temple and the temple service. And of course, we know it was that way there in Jesus' day. I was thinking about the example of Simon there in the book of Acts, who tried to buy the Holy Spirit or with money. He offered the apostles money, like it was going to be some sort of an exchange here to get one for the other and to get power and to get all this wonderful influence. And it's obvious that they were doing the same thing. Paul was still having to deal with that. And you may be right. It may be Satan's way of working his way into the church of God, one person at a time, by introducing somebody that's of, immoral character.
Like Judas. And we can't put all the blame on Satan. Obviously, human nature plays a part, but he knows how to play it. And I think he's seated in those hundreds of Christians in Rome, some people that he thought he could use in the future. And church history says the next century, the church at Rome started to change, and other places as well. And we all know what eventually happened, right? So the Satan is pretty clever, and he never gives up.
No.
Even when Paul, I think it was when he was leaving Ephesus, he said, I know you're not going to see my face again, but he knew that there was those among him that would seek power and authority over that church there. He knew it. He could see that there will arise some among you that are, that will subvert the church. And we know that shortly after Paul left there, or after Paul's death, the church at Ephesus disintegrated, and it was no longer. So it did eventually fall apart. And I guess he saw that concern about with the people at Rome as well.
And so it almost We just have to stay closer to God, because we always assume, well, Satan will recruit somebody else, but not a nice person like me. Well, I mean, don't everyone assume, well, I'm too spiritual. Satan can never corrupt me, right?
Even Paul had he even had I think he never lived down the fact that he persecuted the church. I think he always felt like he needed to do more to make up for what he had done to the church, because he said that over and over again. I persecuted the church. Remember that. I'm not that important. I persecuted the church at one time in my life.
That would actually make you more, I don't know, bold in what you're doing, knowing that you were forgiven for the most heinous thing just about you could be forgiven for by the person who held all the cards and for all of it, for all of mankind, would make you pretty bold in what you had to accomplish. Despite that, may be why he was called, because he could speak out, I don't know, from his heart, maybe more than any of them, because of what he had done, and knowing how much was offered him or given to him, despite the fact of what he'd done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in a business class, and we were a little section about business ethics, and I just said, well, you can never take a bribe from a vendor. I won't go into all the details. And there were several students saying, well, I could take money or sex or whatever it was from a vendor, and it wouldn't affect my judgment. And that's how naive these they're only like 20 years old. It's how naive they were. There's no way you can take bribes and have it not affect you, your decision making. It's just not possible. You think it's possible when they first start bribing you, and then they start bribing you with more money and more stuff. And before you know it, you belong to them and not the company you're supposed to represent.
Exactly. Right. Pretty soon you let their spy balloons float across the entire nation before you decide to shoot it down. Did I say that out loud?
Now, they did shoot it down after its circumference the country, though. They didn't let it.
After it crossed all of our sensitive military locations and phoned home like E.T., then we shot it down.
But then they got busy. They shot down a couple Hobby Lobby balloons. Science fair balloons.
The guys had a $5 Mylar balloon and a $20 computer that they bought on Amazon. They were trying to take some readings with it, and they blew it out of the sky with a $500,000 Sidewinder missile from a from a $150 million jet.
You can see why the world is frightened to death of American leadership, man. And what's scary is Xi of China is making the peace deal with Saudi Arabia and Iran, and trying to make the peace deal with Russia. And I mean, they're playing the role of world leader and diplomat. Never mind, I'll get into it. But you can see it's almost like a sea change, isn't it?
There is no good outcome from any of that.
We will see how it all works out. But all I can say, pray for America. We're going to need it.
When they organize our enemies and our friends against us, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Well, next week we're going to talk more about money, about capitalism, but I don't want to give it away. But because I do think capitalism is under attack, and I guess we will see. And people are being miseducated in school to believe that capitalism, free enterprise is bad, and big government is good. And isn't almost the essence of the American Revolution was the least amount of government necessary? That's what they wanted.
Yeah, very little.
But by the way, like you said, Ken, they don't teach American history anymore.
No, they don't. They don't teach any of that. They want you ignorant. The valedictorian in the Detroit schools scored a 38 in math.
What's the average on that? Do you know what it is?
Oh, I have no idea, but a 38 out of, I mean, 100 is what's possible.
Yeah. So they're way below average, though. Way
Oh, they're
below average.
below fail, but
Yeah.
that was what they scored. 38. That was their grade average.
Oh, by the way, I might have said this last week. I said it to some people last week. Remember when the union president Weingarten denied that it was her fault that schools, especially in big blue cities, were closed for 2 years? Those kids, I think they intentionally want to dumb down the public.
Easier to
You know,
control.
it wasn't just a stupid mistake. I think they want to dumb down the American people.
Oh yeah, it's intentional. It's all intentional. None of this stuff's accidental. They're not stupid people. They know what they're doing. They're just wrong.
Well, I think they are trying to dumb down, and they're succeeding at it. You know, they really are.
Me and me
Uh,
and me and Kristen, my daughter, were talking about it tonight. We talked about critical thinking. Critical thinking is not taught anywhere anymore. You're not taught critical thinking in any avenue of our society because people who can think for themselves and think critically are hard to govern. They're
they want a
hard to
bunch of
govern wrong, I should say. They're hard to mislead.
they want a, a whole society of followers and not any leaders.
Yep, all sheep.
We, you said these other nations are afraid of the leadership of the United States. The American people are afraid of the leadership of the United States. You know, we're terrified where some of this leadership is going to lead us with the decisions that are being made, like what's happening down here on our southern border here in Texas. I mean, it's a travesty. You feel terribly helpless, but you know that that is going to create a monumental problem in our society, both with the strain on, you know, the social system that we have here in America that's made for our citizenry, but also the job market. You know, what kind of you know, they caught, evidently it wasn't publicized, but I heard that they caught somebody with an explosive device trying to get across the border.
I
I
heard
did
that.
hear about that.
I heard that. Yeah.
That wasn't in the news, but how many more have made it across with a device and made it, you know, their way in the United States and are planning to bomb one of our cities? I don't even want to think about what that might mean.
Yeah. Dan in the chat room reminded me that in Oregon, you can graduate without math or reading ability. Now,
Oh.
you can you employ someone like that? They're unemployable.
Yeah. I guess they feel that the electronics, computers are doing all that work for us now, so you don't really need to know those things anymore. You know, ever had tried to get somebody at a store count back change to you when their computer goes down?
They can't do it. It's embarrassing to watch them.
But a lot of things to watch and be aware of and to pray about and to be concerned. You know, I always pray for God's people that they'll be given the strength to endure what the things that come along the way and things that we have no control over that are out of our hands. And, you know, we can be strong and use the influence that we have, as Paul did when he appealed to Rome, our legal rights that we have, as long as we have them, and the peace that we enjoy now, even though we're in the midst of a miry situation with our country, we still have relative peace now, and we can still use that to our advantage.
Yep, as long as it holds out.
Well, I want to thank everybody who are watching and for everybody for all the Ken and Stan and of course Ken, the other Ken. And we'll see you all next week. And we'll also be discussing more about financial stuff, and you can give your input and other problems at Pentecost, Green Turtle Bay, exit 31A off of I-24. For those of you that are interested in coming, the last service will be 1:30 on Sunday, but there'll be a service at 2:30 on Saturday.
All right. With that said, I'm going to
Great.
say thanks for watching, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Sabbath, and good night, everybody.
Good night.
Ken.
So long, everybody. Good night.
We're happy you could make it, and so glad you are here, and hope that we've been able to make God's word more clear.